So now we've gone over most of the things that are relevant to the basic project management plan, but there's a few more things that we need to complete in order to have a comprehensive plan. So the question is, what else do we need? Well, we need a project communication plan. We need to determine the project risk. We need to look at this thing called reserves or contingencies. And then we need to look at a project procurement plan and what does that actually mean. So we shall begin looking at communications. It's often said that the three most important things in project management are communications, communications, and communications. There's a wise saying to do with communications, and that is fundamentally to think that that someone's actually heard what you've communicated. So one of the things you need to do when you make a communication plan, you need to determine the what. What are you going to say? When are you going to say it? How are you going to say it? How often you're going to say it? And to whom are you going to say it to? So make sure that your message has some value to it and not just an email sent out to broadcast to everyone, right? And when are you going to do it? The frequency should be the frequency of the recipient. When would that individual like to get the message? How are you going to do it? What sort of form? Is it going to be verbal, face-to-face? Is it going to be on a website? Is it going to be an email? Those things are just actually how you're going to do it, and may differ depending on who your stakeholders are. How often, the frequency, the person needs it every minute, every hour, every day, every week, every month, every year. And to whom? And it's crucial to understand that some people want to know, some people don't want to know. So it's better to go and to figure out to whom are you going to communicate. Now, the question here is, wow, how the heck do I figure this all out? Well, remember way back when we talked about stakeholder analysis, and I talked about that you have an interview with him? With whoever your stakeholder are, what you do at that particular point in time is you ask these questions. We're going to have communications throughout our project. How would you like to? What would you like to see? When would you like to see it? What frequency? All those sorts of things. You ask that as part of that interview that you do way back with your stakeholders, and then implement that plan. In project management, we do a lot of planning, and we have a lot of templates that we use. And you'll find under the resource area of this course, you'll find many of the templates that I'm going to refer to in the next few little slides here. But simply, templates are there to guide you, to help you take them, modify them, use them the way you want to. But this particular template for the communication planning is basically to describe the purpose of it, who the owner is, the person who needs to carry it out, and what you're going to use in the frequency. Just a guideline for you to reference back to how you're going to communicate with all your stakeholders. Now we're going to look at the next item that needs to be addressed as part of your completing your project plan, and that's risk. It can be said with accuracy that every project has risk associated with it. It's up to us as the project manager and the project team to identify what those risks are. Let's define risk. Risk is an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has an effect on the project. So anything that has an impact, either positively or negatively, on our project can be considered a risk. There are 4 steps in risk management planning. We call this the 4 steps of risk management, the process. First of all, you identify your risk. You must analyze your risk. You must come up with a plan for that risk. And then lastly, you must have some sort of mechanism of how you monitor and control the risk so that you will know when a risk is actually going to occur. Risk identification is one of the easiest steps in identifying risk. Simply because we ask this question, what can go wrong with this plan? Now, people can always find things that will go wrong with your plan. So be prepared that when you ask this question of anyone, stakeholders, team members, anyone that has a vested interest in your project, that you will get a lot of answers back and a lot of ideas of what can go wrong with your plan. Here's some tools or approaches we can use to identify risks. One is we can do brainstorming, as we demonstrated earlier when we did the work breakdown structure. Just give everyone stickies, get them to write down what they think the risk is and put it on the wall and organize it from there. We can do interviews. We can do an interview one-on-one. We can do an interview with the groups. We can interview departments. We can interview outside people and gather from them what they think the risks are to the project. The next thing is our assumptions. Every assumption that we rate in our project charter is in fact a risk because the assumption is written in a positive manner. So we're saying, for example, our budget is approved. The risk is our budget doesn't get approved. We can look at checklists, and we can buy checklists from organizations, especially if we're in a specialized area. And then we can get checklists from there, or we can create our own. The other way we can look at historical projects, and we can look at the risks associated with those projects, and we can ask the question whether those risks are still valid with our project. And those are the tools that we can use to identify risk. This is another template we use in project management just to record every risk that we have, and regardless of the risk, every risk should be recorded in a register. And what you do is you track that risk, and you can determine whether it's active or not, as you can see here. And once it's not active, you don't have to worry about it anymore. And you'll see on this little template we have a P and an I there. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. So as mentioned in the previous slide, we talked about doing a risk analysis, and the P stands for probability and the I stands for impact. So when we look at a risk, we want to look at the probability of that risk actually occurring, and then we want to look at the impact as if that risk did occur. And this is a little grid. You can use a number, and you can go 1 to 5, 1 to 10, up the left-hand side and down the bottom. Either way you want to do it, or you can use a color system like this. But the whole idea is to take each one of your risks and ask yourself, what is the probability of this risk actually occurring? And if the risk does occur, what is the impact of this? Now let me give you an example of what I mean. Let's say, for example, that you live in an earthquake area, but you haven't had an earthquake in 100 years. Now, the probability of that earthquake to your project, the probability of actually occurring during the length of your project is probably very, very low. But the impact to your project, if the earthquake actually happens, is very, very high. So you can see by doing that, that you can see that the probability and impact are opposing each other. And what you really need to focus on, because you have so many risks, you need to really focus on the areas that are up in this quadrant, high impact and high probability. And we say when you have high impact and high probability, you should most definitely create a project response plan or risk response plan for those risks. You've now analyzed your risks. Now what you need to do is, for those high impact and high probability risks, you need to do some planning. So the plans to handle risk should be appropriate and consider the priority of the risk and the cost of the risk and the timing of the risk. So when we say when you create a plan, the plan can't occur more cost or take longer than if you just allowed the risk to actually occur. So one thing that happens with project managers, they have very elaborate plans for a risk actually happens, when a risk actually happens. And the reality is that costs more and takes longer than if the risk actually occurred. So when you create your plans, make sure you understand the priority of the risk. Make sure it's only for the high impact and high probability areas. Make sure the cost is not greater than if the risk actually occurred, and make sure it takes less time than the time it would take to adjust to the risk if it actually occurred. So now we're going to look at some common responses to how you do risk planning. You can do avoidance. Avoidance basically means don't do whatever that task was that's too risky. Just don't do it. Replace it with some other tasks. The next thing is transference, where you can actually transfer that risk from your area to some other area. An example of this, if you have something that requires specialized knowledge, but you don't actually have those skills in your area, what you do is you may hire a contractor to do that, and so therefore it's up to them to ensure that that task gets done correctly. Right? Now just remember one important thing: even though you transferred the risk over to the contractor, you're still responsible to make sure the contractor performs as per the contract. The next thing you do is mitigation. Mitigation is where you actually come up with a detailed plan of how you're going to overcome the risk and handle the risk when it actually occurs. Or you can do what's called acceptance. You can just accept it, and you can say, okay, I'm going to accept this risk actively and produce a contingency, and that means allocate funds, time, and energy to handle that risk, or passively just say, well, we'll worry about it when it happens. So those are the keys that you can use to do risk planning. We're next going to explore the wonderful world of reserves, or often called contingencies. Reserves or contingencies. Interesting topic, this unto itself, is that in many organizations, the organization has determined that for every project they're going to allow what's called a contingency. It's basically an overrun. They'll say, well, our contingency, because we don't know what we don't know, we're going to allow 10% overrun. We're going to allow whatever the budget is, add 10% on it, 15% or 20%. The challenge that comes with that is, for example, if you have $1 million budget and you turn around and you have 10%, you now have $1,100,000 allocated to that project. Now, project managers are pretty clever. They'll go spend the $1.1 million, even though they may not need it. May not need it for things that the contingency is aimed to overcome. The better way to look at this is actually coming up with a reserve. The reserve takes two areas or two components of a reserve, or contingency reserve, amount retained to cover known cost. So for example, when we do risk planning and we have a plan for the risk, we need to produce a cost estimate for those particular risk plans. And then what we need to do is then allocate that fund as a reserve, but don't draw on that reserve until the risk actually occurs. So it's not added to our budget. It's just sitting there. The organization will keep that money set aside, but we only get access to that money when the risk actually occurs. We draw it out as we need it. That's a reserve. And then we have this other thing called the management reserve. It's amount retained to cover unknown risk. This is your traditional contingency, the 5 or 10%. Again, this should only be allocated, not given. It should be reserved, either it's 5 or 10% or whatever the management reserve is in your organization, but it shouldn't be drawn on unless it qualifies as an unknown risk. Now we have our known risk, which we have our contingency reserve for. If it's not part of that, then that's where we draw this other management reserve from for the unknown risk, and only then. So what we basically have is we have our budget of, say, $1 million, as I alluded to earlier, but we don't add any extra money on that. We just reserve that money, and we only draw on it when these things occur, either a known risk or unknown risk. Now this becomes much more financially responsible for projects, and holds the project managers more accountable to doing better estimates for what it actually costs to do that. So it's a wonderful tool. I suggest that you, if you don't have it in your organization, you might want to talk to a few people and see if there's something that they'd like to implement. Procurement. This is the last item that we need in order to complete our plan. Now, procurement usually is handled by a department that looks after procuring goods in most organizations. However, I'm going to suggest in the next couple slides that project managers need to start taking a more active role in understanding procurement. The reason I suggest that project managers should in fact take a more active role in procurement planning is because we're not just procuring goods anymore. We're actually procuring skills or talent or organizations that could perform tasks for us as part of our project. And the reason for this is quite simple, is that we often don't have those specialized skills within our organization, so we have to go and seek those skills from other organizations. And it means that we have to procure them, and it means we actually have to set up contracts with them and have some sort of idea of how they can actually achieve that. So we'll touch about a couple of different documents that we'd use to do procurement of resources. So let us explore some of the documents that are used in procurement. Okay, first of all, there's a request for information, an RFI. Request for information is when you don't really know what you want, but you know that you want something. So what you do is you come up with a little guideline and ask people to provide information about how you would actually achieve something and send it off to organizations that specialize in that. Let me give you a good example. Let's take project management, for example. Let's say that within your organization, you don't have any project management office, you don't have any special project management people there, but you have this very important project. What you do is you would send off a request for information because you have no idea what are the main components in project management, and you would send off a request for information for project management companies that provide that service, that you then would get some idea of what components, what things need to take place in order for a project to be run successfully. So that's an idea where you use an RFI. A request for a quotation is basically when you know what you want and you can explicitly tell what you want, and you can send it out to different organizations, and they are fundamentally competing on price. As simple as that. Now there is another RFQ. It's called a request for qualifications. The request for qualifications comes about when there may be literally thousands of organizations that would reply back to your request for proposal. And by law, anyone who replies back for a request for proposal has to be evaluated, has to be ranked, and has to be informed of what their ranking is as related to that request for proposal. That may take a huge amount of your time or your project team's time to go through that. If, for example, you do not adequately or equally go through and assess everyone that's applied back for your request for proposal, you're liable to be sued for the full amount of that project that's been awarded to somebody else, because you have to turn around and evaluate every one of those requests for proposals that's given back to you. So what organizations are doing is they send out what's called a request for qualifications, where they send it out to the thousands of people, but they basically have some criteria that qualifies that organization to go on to the next stage, which is the request for proposal. The request for proposal is basically a document you create that's asking for someone to provide a product or service to you based on some criteria. And the criteria is spelled out, the evaluation criteria is spelled out for them, and the awarded amount of points awarded for each one of those answers is also spelled out for them. And that's given off to individuals or organizations where they actually reply back to that. And again, as an organization, you are compelled to actually evaluate each one of those in order to make an assessment, and you must let people know what they scored, and anyone has the right to have a review with you. So it can be quite time consuming. Now my advice to these RFs, I's, Q's, or P's is treat that as if it was a project unto itself. The last thing I want to briefly touch on is contract types. Now, I don't want you to become a lawyer. You don't need to be a lawyer to understand contract types, but as a project manager, you need to have some sort of idea of the type of contracts you can actually create with vendors out there to provide services for you. One is fixed price, and it simply is for X amount of work, we're going to pay you Y number of dollars. Very simple, very efficient, very good for both parties, as long as the statement of work, the why they're going to pay that organization, is clearly defined. The cost reimbursement is basically the same idea, a statement of work agreed to by both yourself and the vendor out there, but it's basically a fixed amount plus any cost associated in them to deliver that statement of work. So it's a little bit more in favor of the vendor than it is to your organization. A time and materials is basically an open contract that says, we don't know how long it's going to take, but we can do the job, and we're going to charge you so much for our time and so much for everything that supports our time. That really does favor the vendor and doesn't necessarily favor the organization. So those are the three main types of contracts. Now there are variations and combinations of each one of those. You basically need to just get an understanding of that, because it'll probably be up to you to administer those contracts if indeed it's for skills or talent or resources.